The renowned Pensacola educator Nathan Burrell Cook Sr. was born on July 20, 1835 in the town of Hayneville in Lowndes County, Alabama, the son of John Pope Cook and Charlotte Kirk Massey. His father supported his family as a wealthy planter while Nathan studied to be a pharmacist. By 1860, his father was already worth $20,000 in real estate and $60,000 in personal assets. Young Nathan was also a direct descendant of Captain John Cook, who served with George Washington's cousin, Colonel William Washington, and his Legion of Dragoons during the Revolutionary War. On April 13, 1857, Nathan had married a young orphan woman by the name of Miss Sarah Sallie Johnson, who would bear him 2 children prior to the war. Henry and Sallie were now well on their way to a large and happy family. His work as a druggist and with his farmland under till, he was able to amass $3,000 in real estate and $13,000 in personal assets. Everyone was happy until the clouds of war began to gather over the horizon. The two behemoth issues of slavery and states' rights collided on April 12, 1861, and America was thrown into a disastrous civil war. Every able-bodied male was forced to make a decision to fight for either the North or the South. Listen to Nathan's own words describing his wartime experiences. Born and raised in the Deep South, Nathan and his older brother George Massey Cook felt they had no choice but to enlist on May 6, 1861 in Company M of the famous 6th Alabama Infantry Regiment. Organized in Montgomery, Alabama, they boarded the northbound trains, arriving at Manassas Junction on June 16. Encamped, they waited until July 21, 1861, when the two armies attacked with the regiment being held in reserve. On May 31, 1862, the two armies collided once again, at 7 Pines, where they lost 108 men killed and 283 wounded out of the 632 soldiers engaged. One of those 108 men killed on May 31 was Nathan's brother Sergeant George Massey Cook. His remains were apparently shipped home to Pioneer Cemetery in Greenville, Alabama, and buried next to his wife Emma Herbert, who had died in 1860. After seeing that his brother's body was sent home, Nathan would go on to fight in every engagement of 1862 with Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. On September 17, his regiment was stationed at the Sunken Road during the Battle of Sharpsburg, also known as Antietam. There, after some of the most desperate fighting of the war, the regiment would lose 52 men killed with 104 wounded. However, because of his pharmaceutical training, a request had been forwarded to the Secretary of War in August 1862 to transfer Nathan to the Medical Corps. The approval for his commission as a hospital steward did not arrive until the day after the battle. At that time, he was still on the battlefield preparing to cross the Potomac River that night, as the army retreated back into Virginia. On the morning of the 19th, Nathan wasted no time turning in his rifle and cartridge pouch to a new recruit. After the goodbyes and good lucks, Nathan headed for Richmond and his new assignment. Upon reaching Richmond, he reported into General Samuel Preston Moore and requested a 30-day leave, which was granted. When he returned, he most likely was deployed to Chimborazo Hospital, the largest Confederate hospital of the war, or one of its outlying facilities. As General Lee prepared for the invasion of the North in 1863, Nathan and his medical unit was sent to Staunton, Virginia. This town lay at the strategic crossroads of the Virginia Central Railroad, as well as the North-South Valley Turnpike and the East-West Staunton-Parkersburg Turnpike. And because of its central location in the midst of so many battles, it became a haven for numerous Confederate hospitals. Then came word to pack up and move 25 miles north to Harrisonburg, Virginia, where they were told to organize and maintain a hospital there. The town also had the distinction of being at the crossroads of the Valley Turnpike and the Rockingham Turnpike, placing it only 131 miles from Washington, D.C. Even more important, the county was one of the most fruitful producing counties in the South. His unit would remain there until after the Great Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863. Following this pivotal battle, Nathan and his unit were ordered to Petersburg, Virginia in preparation for the upcoming bloodbath of 1864. But as the fighting began to move south, they were ordered to Charleston, South Carolina, at the end of January 1864. He was ordered to report to Dr. John Lawrence Dawson upon his arrival. He would serve under him until around July, when Dawson resigned and Nathan was sent to Columbia, South Carolina. As the Union Army began its offensive, the casualties mounted astronomically, with the Confederate Army fighting one defensive battle after another. As the year 1865 dawned, the Southern Army was in total retreat on all fronts. Union General William T. Sherman had marched from Atlanta to Savannah in his infamous March to the Sea, and was now turning north into South Carolina. In response, Dr. Robert Lebby Jr. ordered Nathan to report to General Pierre Beauregard's medical director Dr. Ozlar in Charleston, South Carolina. This he did on the morning of February 5, 1865, where he was informed that Charleston was to be evacuated on February 17, and all hospitals were to be closed except for the one that fronted on King Street and continued to Meeting Street. After all patients were transferred to this hospital, they were told the Army would be leaving with Cook and his fellow stewards remaining with them to become prisoners of war. Nathan could draw all the medical and quartermaster supplies he needed for their care before the Army's departure. That evening during a break, Nathan went up to the hospital's roof and looked out over the city's skyline and saw the most spectacular sight he had ever seen before or since. Thousands of cotton bales had been piled up on the wharves ready to be shipped out through the Federal naval blockade. These were set ablaze to prevent them from falling into the hands of the Union Army. The blaze had spread from the Eastern Railroad station on the Cooper River to the east and all along the city front and up the Ashley River as far as the Savannah and Charleston Railroad. All of it was an inferno from hell. Nathan stated that he thought of the great Napoleon at Moscow, who had seen the same thing and exclaimed, "It was a sea of fire." In the classic 1939 movie of Gone with the Wind, this scene was replicated once again in all of its splendor. By dawn, the Confederate Army was gone, leaving only Dr. Lebby and Robinson, Wardmaster Jacob Rampy, hospital steward Nathan Burrell Cook, and several faithful female nurses to care for the 125 sick and severely wounded soldiers. By 10 a.m., the Union forces under the command of Union General Quincy Adams Gilmore marched in and took over Charleston. However, they paid little attention to the hospital or its personnel. Within 6 weeks, all but 20 of the patients had either died or had recovered to the point they were paroled and released. Since Nathan's office was in the headquarters building, he got to know quite a few of the Union medical staff, who finally called on them after their arrival. On March 17, 1865, Nathan was sitting on the front steps of the hospital when he was handed a note that read, "The hospital will be closed on Monday, and all of the attendants will be put in jail." He quickly sought out his comrade Jacob Anderson Rampy and suggested they try to escape. Jacob was 64 years old and was a wardmaster from the 19th Georgia Infantry Regiment. The two decided to get 2 boards, drill 2 holes in each end and tie empty canteens in each one for flotation. After dark, they approached the Ashley River. However, they made so much noise that they attracted the attention of a Union picket on the far side of the river. Several enemy soldiers put out in a skiff and pulled up alongside the struggling men in the middle of the river. One of them yelled out to them, "Johnnies, come out of the wet." Nathan and Jacob had no choice but to surrender, as they were pulled into the boat and set out for the shore. Pulling up on shore, they all walked over to a big fire, as the other pickets all had a good laugh at the soaking wet escapees. After being pulled from the Ashley River, Nathan and Jacob were fed and treated well until the next morning, when they were handed over to the officer of the day. Upon seeing the young prisoners, the Union officer asked the sergeant of the guard, "What did you bring them here for? Don't you think we have enough of such stock, and couldn't you have disposed of them?" So, the guard marched them off to the main camp, where they sat around a fire while they cooked breakfast. As soon as the other Union men saw two enemy soldiers in their midst, they began to gather round and throw barbs at the two hapless prisoners. The insults moved quickly from joking to a more serious nature. Nathan took the ribbing for a while, and then attempted to trade insults with one particular aggressive soldier from Minnesota. Finally, in a fit of rage, the soldier ran off and picked up a hatchet and headed back with the intention of killing Nathan. At the last moment, some of the pickets that had pulled them out of the river stepped in front of Nathan with their rifles to protect him. After things cooled down, Nathan and Jacob were taken into Charleston and brought before Colonel Steward Lyndon Woodford from New York. He asked them several questions and then ordered the guards to take them to the Charleston City Jail and lock them up as prisoners of war. On May 1st, he and Jacob were released from the jail and given their parole. They were then loaded into a 4-horse ambulance along with Dr. Robert Lebby, Dr. Robinson, and a Lieutenant Owens. They were escorted out of town by a troop of federal cavalry until they reached the small town of Summerville, South Carolina, just 19 miles from Charleston. There, they were turned over to the last armed Confederates that Nathan ever saw in his life. But the war was now over, and it was time to go home. All the way home he thought about the 1,400 comrades he had enlisted with, but there was only 84 left in his old regiment. But he and Jacob had been lucky, and they now left Summerville heading west by way of Augusta, Georgia. Their parole papers allowed them to get some food from Union troops along the way, but this usually consisted of only a loaf of bread. Their mode of travel was most likely by foot, since Union troops had torn up the Southern Railroad tracks. Either way, it was a long trip to Augusta and on to Atlanta. From Atlanta they headed for Chambers County, Alabama, where Jacob dropped off and headed home. Nathan continued his odyssey to Montgomery, Alabama, where he was escorted to the Provost Marshal's office and had his parole papers stamped and given another loaf of bread. From Montgomery, it was only 24 miles to Hayneville in Lowndes County and home. Although his arrival home was a joyous one, it also would bear heartbreaking memories of what he had lost. During his absence he had lost his father in 1864, his brother George at the Battle of Seven Pines in 1862, and 3 children, Henry, George, and an infant daughter that same year. But Nathan returned to Sallie nevertheless, and the two would start all over in Greenville, Alabama, in 1870, where he had become a merchant. During the 10 years of Reconstruction, he had already accrued real estate valued at $8,000, and a personal estate in the same amount. Also, during this same period, Sallie had given birth to 3 children. For whatever reason, he and Sallie decided to move to Pensacola on December 2, 1875, even though the South was still under Union rule in the latter part of the Reconstruction period. They moved their belongings into a house at the corner of De Villiers and Gregory Streets, whereby Nathan re-entered the merchant business downtown. But in 1885, the state legislature, for the first time, set forth the creation of an elected school board whose members would then elect a superintendent. Thus, George S. Hallmark, Joseph Dennis Wolfe, Alexander Weiss Clubs, Philip Keyes Young, and Ernest Whitmire were elected to the new school board. Of the men that submitted their name, they chose Nathan as their Superintendent of Public Instruction. He had already been a voluntary teacher, so he felt like he had a lot to offer in a more officious academic position. Around 1890, he and Sallie would move into a house at 320 East Gadsden Street, where they remained for the rest of their lives. In his new position, Nathan set about building a new academic program for Pensacola's children. According to John Appleyard, Cook's plans focused on employing higher quality instructors, and he succeeded by quietly gathering several men who were titled professors and young ladies with college training, a rarity at that date. Buildings were leased, teachers were hired, and textbooks were provided at the expense of the parents. Applegate stated, Cook felt that a student would give greater care and use to a book if he owns it. This premise would dominate the thinking of the parents of the baby boomers when it came to their child's first automobile. By 1896, Escambia County contained 51 schools and 81 teachers. Within this group of instructors were such historical noted names as Agnes McReynolds, Annie Kopman Suter, Ocker Clubs, and Allie Yniestra. In 1885, Florida began offering military pensions to Confederate veterans and 4 years later to their widows. Nathan would apply for his in 1906, which was approved in 1907 for the yearly amount of $120. In 1912, the Florida legislature passed a bill changing the superintendent's position from an appointed to an elective position. For whatever reason, Cook refused to campaign for his office and chose to accept the strategy that the people know me and what I stand for. His opponent was Albert Sedley Septimus Edwards, who won the election. Nathan left his position quietly and with dignity before passing away in 1917. In his honor of all the accomplishments he garnered throughout his 28 years as superintendent, an Escambia County school still bears his name. As for Jacob Anderson Rampy, he remained in Chambers County, Alabama for the rest of his life. He had been one of the pioneers of the county, having moved there with nothing more than a small wagon drawn by a blind horse. Yet, through hard work and dedication, he had acquired property and made a fine home for he and his family. He had served the call to arms with the 19th Georgia Infantry Regiment during the war. Because of his advanced age, he had been transferred to the Confederate Hospital as a wardmaster, where he met Nathan Cook. When the war ended, he returned to his home and never left again. In February 1884, he was confined to his bed before passing away 4 weeks later, on March 20, at his home located 4 miles north of Fredonia, Alabama. As for the Union officer who paroled Nathan and Jake and sent them home, his fate took him on a different course. Colonel Stuart Lyndon Woodford came close to being the Vice President of the United States and eventually wound up as the Foreign Minister to Spain. He had left the war as a brevet brigadier general before becoming a U.S. congressman from 1873 to 1874. He had also served as lieutenant governor of New York from 1867 to 1868 before his unsuccessful candidacy for governor in 1870. He was the United States District Attorney for the Southern District of New York from 1877 to 1883. He was appointed the U.S. Minister to Spain from 1897 to 1898, where he married his private secretary in 1900.